It was supposed to be a routine supply drop, but nothing in Vietnam was ever routine. The rotor blades of a UH-1 Huey sliced through the humid jungle air as crates of ammunition dangled beneath it. Below, the world burned. Tracer rounds cutting the darkness, radio chatter drowning in static, and the ground convulsing under the sound of mortars. The pilot's voice cracked through the comms. "We're not fighting the Viet Cong. We're fighting the jungle itself." Operation Velvet Glove. The name sounded poetic, even gentle. But in reality, it was the soft hand that fed the monster. Behind every bullet fired, every napalm strike ordered, there were trucks, choppers, and faceless men keeping the machine alive. America called it logistics. The Vietnamese called it survival. In the textbooks, the war was about ideology, communism versus freedom, dominoes falling across Asia. But in the mud and monsoon of Vietnam, it was about something far more primitive. Could you get fuel to the next hill before the convoy blew up? Could you drop rations before the jungle swallowed the trail again? By 1968, the US military had turned logistics into an art form, or an addiction. They built entire floating cities in the South China Sea, airlifted fresh steaks to soldiers in the jungle, and measured progress not in territory, but in tonnage. Every gallon of gasoline shipped across the Pacific was a quiet prayer that the war still had a purpose. Somewhere between Saigon's whirring airfields and the endless convoys crawling up Route 19, the line between victory and maintenance blurred. America wasn't just sustaining a war, it was sustaining the illusion of control. And that's the tragedy of Operation Velvet Glove. It wasn't about conquest. It was about keeping the heartbeat of a dying war from stopping, one truckload at a time. When history looks back, it won't remember the heroics of battle, but the endless, desperate logistics of a superpower trying to outrun its own doubt. Because sometimes wars don't end when you stop fighting. They end when you stop delivering supplies. Operation Velvet Glove was never a headline war. It was the silent backbone of America's longest miscalculated gamble. The belief that efficiency could replace meaning. That if you kept the trucks rolling and the airstrips open, somehow victory would find its way to you. At its core, the operation represented the quintessential American paradox. Limitless resources serving a purpose that was crumbling from within. Washington spoke of freedom and containment, but the men in the field spoke of mud, fuel, and broken engines. The real front line wasn't the Mekong or Khe Sanh. It was the endless supply routes stretching from Saigon to Pleiku, arteries pulsing with cargo, feeding a war that had already lost its soul. The irony was bitter. America's logistical genius, the very thing that had crushed the Axis powers 2 decades earlier, had now become its blindfold. The same machine that once symbolized order was now running on inertia, moving forward because no one dared to stop it. This is the untold story of how a superpower's strength became its trap. A velvet glove wrapped tightly around its own throat. Before Velvet Glove became a logistical leviathan in Southeast Asia, it was the brainchild of men who had worshipped the efficiency of war. Among them stood General Frank S. Besson, Jr., the quiet architect of America's modern supply doctrine. Besson wasn't a battlefield commander. He was a mathematician in uniform, a believer that wars were won not by bravery, but by systems. During World War II, he had orchestrated the flow of tanks, ammunition, and food across 2 oceans. To him, Vietnam was not chaos, it was a test case. By the early 1960s, Washington's military brain trust had been reshaped by this breed of engineer soldiers. They were men raised in the glow of IBM Punchcard and Rand Corporation graphs, the systems analysis generation. They saw war as data, logistics as science, and human error as a solvable glitch. Robert McNamara, the brilliant but cold Secretary of Defense, became their patron saint. "If you can measure it," he once said, "you can control it." Besson's disciples in Vietnam took that gospel literally. They built bases like industrial complexes, connected by meticulously numbered highways and supply depots. Each convoy became a moving spreadsheet, every gallon of fuel accounted for, every bullet tracked. It was in their minds the triumph of order over entropy, the American way to fight chaos itself. Yet beneath the spreadsheets, a darker psychology brewed. Many of these men had never set foot in the jungles their maps so neatly described. They believed in precision, not people. In Washington's air-conditioned offices, Vietnam was not a bleeding landscape, it was a logistical equation. The irony was painful. The more efficient the machine became, the more detached it grew from reality. Soldiers at the front joked bitterly that they fought not for freedom, but for cargo. A Marine corporal in Quang Tri wrote home, "We measure life here in sea rations and body bags. The trucks come, the trucks go, and the war stays." Thus, the character of America's Vietnam War was born, shaped not by generals or ideologues, but by administrators and accountants. Men who believed that if the system ran smoothly enough, the outcome would take care of itself. In Velvet Glove, they finally got their wish, a war that ran perfectly until it ran out of purpose. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War had outgrown the jungle. It had become a vast ecosystem of contracts, shipments, and corporate alliances. Behind every helicopter and convoy, there was a web of politics and profit, so intricate that even Congress struggled to untangle it. At the center of this web stood the Pentagon's logistics elite, backed by America's most powerful corporations. Boeing built the birds that filled the skies. Bell Helicopter churned out Hueys by the thousands. Dow Chemical shipped drums of napalm as agricultural supplies. General Dynamics and Lockheed supplied parts faster than the troops could wear them out. It wasn't just a war. It was an economy, one where the front lines were managed from air-conditioned boardrooms. Robert McNamara, ever the technocrat, called it rational management of military resources. But inside the Defense Department, some whispered another term, McNamara's Industrial Church. The faith was efficiency, the deity, statistics. The priesthood included analysts from RAND, economists from Harvard, and logisticians from the U.S. Army Materiel Command. Together, they formed the most sophisticated war supply apparatus in history. Political alliances reinforced it. President Lyndon B. Johnson, desperate to avoid looking weak on communism, poured billions into the defense budget, money that flowed straight through Capitol Hill into Texas, Washington State, and California. War became a bipartisan business model. The more material shipped to Southeast Asia, the stronger the illusion that the mission was working. Meanwhile, on the ground, young officers carried out the dream of their elders. They mapped the Ho Chi Minh Trail from the sky, plotted supply routes through the Central Highlands, and tried to turn Vietnam into a factory of war. But the system they built was both brilliant and blind. In theory, the Velvet Glove network could deliver a jeep to any corner of Indochina within 72 hours. In practice, half the cargo never arrived. Convoys were ambushed, airfields flooded, depots bombed. Yet every loss triggered more production, not less. It was self-feeding. A logistical Ouroboros devouring its own tail. In Washington, the numbers still looked beautiful. Tons delivered, gallons pumped, sorties flown. The graphs always rose upward. What they didn't show were the broken convoys smoldering in the rain, or the empty look of soldiers guarding fuel depots they didn't understand the purpose of. This was the true alliance that sustained Velvet Glove. Politicians who needed to look strong, corporations that needed contracts, and logisticians who needed proof that their science worked. Together, they kept the wheels spinning, long after the destination had disappeared. In the corridors of power, efficiency had become morality, and once that happened, the line between progress and madness vanished completely. In early 1967, the U.S. Army launched what was internally dubbed Operation Velvet Glove, a master plan to transform the entire logistics structure of the Vietnam War into a seamless, self-sustaining organism. On paper, it was breathtaking, a supply web stretching from Okinawa to Saigon, from the Philippines to Da Nang, from depots floating in the South China Sea to convoys crawling through the jungle roads of Pleiku. Its centerpiece was the 1st Logistics Command, headquartered in Long Binh, a few miles outside Saigon, a small city of warehouses, fuel tanks, repair shops, and 30,000 men whose job wasn't to fight but to feed the war. From this sprawling complex, everything moved. Rice, rations, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, even ice cream for the officers' mess. The command's motto, painted proudly on the walls, read, "We deliver." The irony was almost cinematic. While soldiers in the field slogged through knee-deep mud, the Long Binh warehouses hummed like Ford assembly lines. Helicopters ferried goods to remote outposts. C-130s lifted jeeps and howitzers over enemy territory. Convoys of hundreds of trucks snaked up Route 19 toward Pleiku, the most dangerous stretch of road in the country, where every bend could hide an ambush. On February 22, 1967, one such convoy, Convoy 153, left Qui Nhon at dawn, it never reached its destination. Near Unkay Pass, the Viet Cong detonated explosives beneath the lead truck, shredding the column into chaos. When the smoke cleared, 27 vehicles were destroyed, 14 soldiers dead, and hundreds of tons of cargo burning in the tropical heat. For hours, the jungle echoed with the sound of exploding ammunition. The after-action report described it clinically. Loss of material, substantial. But even that disaster became a data point. Within a week, the Army dispatched new convoys to replace the lost cargo. The system compensated, recalibrated, and resumed. No lessons learned, just metrics adjusted. Elsewhere, air operations multiplied. Air America and the Military Airlift Command built an aerial highway that carried over 1 million tons of supplies annually. When the monsoon flooded the Mekong Delta, they dropped cargo by parachute. When runways cracked, engineers built floating ones. America had learned to fight geography itself. To the press, this looked like genius. Newsweek ran a headline calling it the miracle of military management. McNamara called it a triumph of operational science. But beneath the polished rhetoric, the numbers told another story. By 1969, 60% of all U.S. troops in Vietnam were non-combat personnel. Cooks, mechanics, drivers, clerks, sustaining a logistical empire that existed mainly to sustain itself. And the costs were monstrous. Each gallon of gasoline burned in-country cost the U.S. taxpayer over $2, not counting transport, security, and risk. Each meal that reached a soldier in the highlands had traveled farther than he had. The Velvet Glove had turned war into a circular equation. Logistics feeding logistics, progress feeding illusion. When General Besson visited Vietnam that same year, he reportedly said, "We have the best supplied army in history. The only thing we're short of is a reason." It was the perfect epitaph for Operation Velvet Glove, a campaign that won every metric and lost every meaning. The supply lines were strong. The purpose was gone. In Washington, Operation Velvet Glove was hailed as the proof that the McNamara Doctrine worked, the idea that wars could be optimized, predicted, and controlled like industrial output. But the deeper it ran, the clearer it became. The system didn't just serve the war, it was the war. The philosophy behind it was simple, seductive, and tragically American. If you can move more, you can win more. Every statistic became a symbol of progress. The Pentagon's nightly briefings showcased tonnage delivered, convoys completed, gallons consumed. A good day wasn't defined by territory secured or hearts won. It was defined by fuel efficiency and airlift volume. War became a numbers game, and Vietnam became its casino. This mindset created what historians later called the tyranny of metrics. It blinded policymakers to the fundamental question: what were they actually achieving? When the numbers looked good, they felt reassured, even as the situation on the ground deteriorated. The very data meant to ensure control had become the camouflage for delusion. The consequences were catastrophic, both strategic and human. In Velvet Glove's obsession with movement, America lost sight of direction. Convoys rolled, aircraft flew, budgets ballooned, but none of it brought victory closer. Worse, the heavy dependence on supply infrastructure tethered the military to static bases that became easy targets. Every depot, every fuel line, every port turned into a vulnerability. Economically, the war's logistical excess became an abyss. By 1971, the U.S. had spent more on transporting material than on producing it. Civilian contractors reaped billions. Brown and Root, the Texas construction giant that later evolved into Halliburton, built entire cities for the Army, cities that would be abandoned within years. It was the prototype of the privatized war economy that would return in Iraq and Afghanistan decades later. Politically, Velvet Glove eroded faith in leadership. Congressional hearings revealed absurd waste, helicopters airlifting beer, million-dollar projects left unfinished, supply officers ordering equipment they didn't need just to keep their quotas. The system rewards movement, not sense. One logistics captain told the Senate Subcommittee on Foreign Operations. The military's faith in technology and control, the very faith that defined mid-century American power, became its own undoing. The United States had built a machine so efficient it couldn't recognize its own futility. And yet, the cultural fallout may have been the most enduring. The Vietnam generation returned home disillusioned, not just by the politics of the war, but by its absurd machinery. The sense that America had industrialized even its mistakes. As historian Christian Appy later wrote, The tragedy of Vietnam wasn't that America couldn't win, it's that it couldn't imagine a world where winning didn't mean consuming. Operation Velvet Glove proved one haunting truth. Logistics can keep a war alive, but they can't keep it honest. By 1970, the cracks in the Velvet Glove illusion had become impossible to hide. The press, the Senate, and even the Pentagon's own analysts began to expose the grotesque contradictions beneath its polished surface. The war that once prided itself on precision had devolved into bureaucratic chaos wrapped in corporate contracts. One of the first bombs dropped on that illusion wasn't from the sky. It was the Pentagon Papers. Leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, the 7,000-page document revealed what many had suspected, that the US government had long known the war was unwinnable, but continued anyway, sustained by inertia, pride, and an industrial engine that could no longer stop. The papers exposed how supply operations were expanded not out of necessity, but to justify continued funding and maintain appearances of control. Senate hearings soon followed. Senator William Fulbright called the logistics apparatus a corporation masquerading as an army. Investigators uncovered warehouses filled with obsolete equipment, ports clogged with unclaimed cargo, and multi-million-dollar contracts awarded without oversight. At Cam Ranh Bay alone, tens of millions of dollars worth of supplies simply vanished, misplaced in accounting. Behind closed doors, generals admitted what journalists screamed in print. The system had become too big to measure, too proud to fail. Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated soldiers in Vietnam, called it the War of the Accountants. He wrote bitterly in Newsweek, "We counted everything, bullets, trucks, gallons of gas, except common sense." Even within the ranks, dissent grew. Officers began falsifying reports to meet quotas. Soldiers joked that the safest job in Vietnam was guarding the warehouses, because even the Viet Cong didn't want what we were shipping. By the time the Watergate scandal exploded in Washington, Velvet Glove had become a symbol of the same disease: overmanagement, deception, and moral exhaustion. The American people no longer saw efficiency, they saw absurdity. In one final report to Congress, a defense analyst summarized the entire operation in a single sentence: "Our supply lines outlasted our credibility." It was both indictment and epitaph. The soft glove that had once promised control had instead smothered the very soul of American strategy. The empire hadn't been defeated by communism. It had been consumed by its own machinery. After the last US helicopter lifted off from Saigon in April 1975, the Velvet Glove didn't disappear. It evolved. Its ghosts resurfaced in the deserts of Iraq, the mountains of Afghanistan, and in every Pentagon PowerPoint that promised efficiency through modernization. The same logistical DNA, the belief that management could outthink chaos, kept replicating itself across decades. In Iraq, the convoys rolled again, this time under private contractors instead of soldiers. Halliburton, the corporate descendant of Brown and Root, became the new First Logistics Command. In Afghanistan, pallets of bottled water were airlifted across continents, while US bases burned diesel at a rate that would shame a small city. History didn't repeat itself, it simply automated its own irony. But the legacy of Velvet Glove wasn't just technological, it was psychological. It reshaped how America thought about war, not as a moral struggle, but as a managerial challenge. It taught generations of policymakers to mistake movement for progress, data for truth, and cost for commitment. In the 1980s and 1990s, the lessons of Vietnam were endlessly dissected, but few understood the real one, that a nation obsessed with efficiency risks becoming a prisoner of its own competence. Logistics, like ambition, has no natural limit. It expands until it devours its purpose. Yet there was also something deeply human in that failure. The same stubbornness that built the Moon program and rebuilt Europe after World War II. The same faith in systems, in doing things right, even when no one remembered why they were done at all. That contradiction, noble in intent, disastrous in outcome, is what makes Velvet Glove one of the most haunting mirrors in American history. Its lesson lingers not in textbooks, but in the quiet arrogance of every new intervention that begins with the words, "We can manage this." The truth is, Velvet Glove did what America does best. It kept the machine running, long after the dream had died. And in that, perhaps, lies the truest lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest power a nation can have is knowing when to stop. There's a haunting image that sums up Operation Velvet Glove. A lone American convoy rumbling through a burned-out road outside Pleiku, the rain hissing on metal, the drivers silent. Behind them, the jungle closes in again. Indifferent, patient, eternal. That's how the war ended. Not with a surrender, not even with a bang, but with the slow fade of engines running out of fuel. The mighty logistical machine that once promised mastery over chaos simply stalled and vanished into the mud it had tried to conquer. History often remembers Vietnam through the lens of politics or protest, but the quieter tragedy lies here, in the belief that control is the same thing as understanding, that precision equals purpose. The men who designed Velvet Glove weren't villains. They were believers. They thought they could outsmart entropy, and for a time, they did. Until the math no longer matched the meaning. In the end, the war became a mirror. It showed America not its strength, but its addiction, the need to quantify, to optimize, to keep moving, even when there's nowhere left to go. As the last trucks left Saigon, one reporter wrote, it wasn't the soldiers who lost Vietnam, it was the planners. 50 years later, that line still cuts through the noise. Because the real question Velvet Glove leaves behind isn't military, it's moral. When a nation can build anything, supply anything, deliver anything, can it still remember why? The soft glove that once symbolized mastery turned out to be something else entirely, a hand too strong to let go, even when the war was already over.